All right, everyone, I think we're gonna get started. Thank you everyone so much for joining us. I'm Allison Beatty. I'm the head of reference here at the Framingham Public Library, and we are thrilled to be starting this brown bag learning program, a tour through fashion history part 2. If you were not available for part 1, or you want to watch it again after seeing the second half of a fabulous presentation, I've put the link to it to our YouTube channel in the chat. So that is available for everyone. And just very briefly, I will just introduce Catherine Byrne. She has an incredible background in fashion and design, having worked for design houses like Ralph Lauren and Calvin Klein. Just an incredible background. And she's currently working as a teacher at the Danforth Art Museum at Framingham State. And without any further ado, I will turn it over to Catherine.
Thanks, Allison. Can you all hear me? Okay. So for those of you that are new to this, again, I've had this obsession with fashion since I was very young. So a lot of what you'll learn is sort of an accumulation of things that I've learned along the way, things that I've thought were interesting. I have a background in art as well. And I also love history. So I love how fashion, art, and history all meet. So fashion is a subject that is so incredibly in depth, so there's so much to learn. So, in 1 hour, we'll just scratch the surface, but I thought I would include some stuff that was fun and interesting to learn about. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. All right, so now hopefully you can see this. Can everybody see it? Can you see it, Allison? Okay, so some of you may have joined for the last one, and we basically covered all the way up until we may actually have gone a little past this, but just for the sake of kind of summarizing where we were, I just wanted to start with around the late 1700s and 1800 and what was happening in the world at that time. And I was discussing the French Revolution and the momentous events that happened and changed the world in Europe at that time. And this guy, this fellow up here on the top with that, that painting that's Jacques-Louis David. And he was the kind of official painter of the revolution. He was actually kind of an integral member of the revolution, and he even was trying to reshape some of the ideals that they were all working towards at that time. More than that changed at that time. Politics were changing, but also fashion was dramatically changing. And so here I had discussed that while people were being guillotined, France was at war with England, Austria, and Prussia. There was an unpopular draft. Religious orders were being disbanded under the Jacobin regime, and Jacques-Louis David was a member of that. Everything was being redefined into this. They wanted a new form of worship. They wanted a new just way of being governed. And the new sort of reverence was for classical antiquity, because that's where the seeds of democracy were first sown. And they were really embracing that as their kind of imagery for how they wanted to define themselves. So you see that in fashion very heavily here. So, before that, in the 1700s, you had the same kind of this silhouette that was very tight at the waist. It was the same for a very long time. And now there's a very dramatic shift. So I don't know if you remember this chemise that Marie Antoinette wore that she got in trouble for, was a very simple cotton dress that was kind of a nod to democracy, simplicity. It was kind of like a peasant type dress as well. But it also offered personal liberty. They were getting rid of the corset. And this pretty much was here to stay for a little while. It also created a new waistline. The waistline went up dramatically. And here are just some images. Menswear had this strange, they were called les merveilleux, sorry about my French accent, marvelous ones. And those were the women, and the men were dubbed les incroyables, the incredible ones. This was a youth subculture. I was talking to my son, who's 12, about this the other day, and I was just laughing because youth subculture is not new. You think of, there are writings throughout history where nobody ever wanted to dress like their parents. You know, they wanted to be different. Obviously times were different. There were more restrictions in certain periods of time, but it's always interesting for me to see what the youth subculture was at a time. And it says so much about where they were going, where they saw their future being. So this particular strange outfit was from the menswear of that time. There's a whole podcast I listened to about this, but they even had a strange way of talking and speaking. They had this crazy hairstyle. They had this, excuse my phone, sorry. They had a cravat that went all the way up the neck that was sort of like a subconscious way of hiding your neck from the guillotine. They used a little spyglass. Excuse me, that's spam. They had other strange accessories as well. They had, I think they even had like a hoop earring. For women, it was definitely this white dress. And so anyway, people called them fashion's first hipsters. And it's just a really fascinating time. So moving on. All right. So this was a new empire, and we see the empire waistline, here to stay for a couple decades. This neoclassical look can be seen all the way up until, you know, the 1830s, where the waistline starts to go down again. But here are just some images. This woman in the middle top, Marie-Joseph Rose Taché de la Pagerie, 1801. She was to marry Napoleon, and she was, there's studies about her. She was a very fashionable woman, and she had these friends. She was, you know, definitely very cool for her time. And she, you know, was definitely a fashionista in her day. And so the corset became known as the short stay. So it actually stayed, but it was basically, when you think about it, it's kind of like a bra, but it just did not remain the same for this period of time. So here's just some images and the time periods that we're talking about. Now, in the early 19th century, I just wanted to talk about this because it's interesting to me. We saw the collapse of the traditional social hierarchy. Now, before the French Revolution, classes were very defined, and certain classes of people were even expected to wear certain outfits. And people really rejected that. They wanted to kind of equalize everybody, but also they were excited about this new empire. And I wanted to just talk about this painting for a minute. If anyone's been to the Louvre in France, in Paris, they might have seen this. It's huge. But at this time, after the revolution, France maintained its position as a world leader of fashion for women, for sure. So we talked about that chemise. It gave way to this new neoclassicism. Geometric forms of Greek and Roman antiquity, very popular. So the new ruler, Napoleon Bonaparte, he seized power in 1799. Then he crowned himself emperor and his wife Josephine empress. Normally, a pope would have crowned you, I believe. And so this was the first time that somebody crowned themselves. And also he crowned his own wife right there in front of everybody. He was the first Frenchman to hold the title of emperor in 1,000 years. So my understanding is that from this painting, he was basically there to say, I'm going to make this revolution worth it. I'm going to make sure that this is going to be a new time of great success. And it's going to be, basically he's kind of promoting himself as well. And he commissioned this painting from that same painter, Jacques-Louis David. So he was the propagandizer of the French Revolution. He later became Napoleon's official painter. So he was commissioned to paint this very moment at Notre Dame Cathedral. The painting, it's really fun. It contains likenesses of real people. So I don't have time to do that here, but you can go through and basically say, oh, this was the ambassador. Like, they know who everybody was, including like Napoleon's sisters were there. This is just a detail of it. It's much bigger than this. And even David, he is painted himself. Up in the upper left, it's above the image of where this is, but there's just a little detail of where he is in the upper rafters. So you'll see a lot of images of Napoleon. This is another painting of him by David, and he's putting his hand in his jacket. So you'll see this throughout. I think there's one of George Washington doing this. Lots of presidents will do this. There's lots of pictures. If you ever wondered why they do this, it's because of this guy. That's pronounced Aeschines, was an orator from Greece. And I was just so curious why they did this. So I looked into it, and basically it's because he felt that by restricting the movement of your hand, it was the proper way to speak in public. So by doing this, you were basically showing your good breeding. You were showing your genteel, calm demeanor, maybe because you're not gesturing with your hands, but also maybe the symbolic power of your words over, your arm movements may have had something to do with it. But this was the reason why they did it. It went all the way back to classical antiquity and this particular famous orator from Greece from this time. So I thought that was kind of interesting. All right, so now I wanted to talk about menswear, because I've been talking a lot about women's wear, but when I was living in New York, I worked for Ralph Lauren, and I worked for a label called Purple Label, which is a really high-end label of menswear, of tailoring. And I learned a great deal about England and about the fabrics that come out of there, about tweeds and houndstooth. I mean, just goes on and on, because a lot of what we did was in the tradition of these like bespoke suits. But so Paris remained the fashion capital of women's wear, basically from then on. But menswear was increasingly centered around England. So even before the French Revolution, they really loved the British look, for sure. There was an Anglomania going on that people wouldn't admit to in France, but they really admired the clothing, especially those worn by men on their country estates. It really kind of represented like a certain freedom that the French were longing for, and a certain style that they admired. So gone at this time were the fussy embroidered silks of the 18th century. We will now start to see unadorned wool in dark colors. So since the 1790s, tailors had been doing business in the area of Savile Row. So that's in the Mayfair area of London. So in 1846, there was a company, Henry Poole and Company. It's a family-owned business. And so they moved at this time to this particular area. And this area started to become known for its high-end men's tailoring shops. So the word bespoke is from the verb to bespeak something, but it's understood to have originated in Savile Row when cloth for a suit was said to be spoken for by individual customers. So you would come into a shop and you'd say, "Oh, I like that." They say, "Nope, that's bespoken for." Someone has already claimed that as a suit that will be made for them. It also would keep it so that you would have one of the only suits like that in your probably peer group, people that are all shopping in the same area. So England did become increasingly known for their beautiful wool fabrics, but in the industry, you call it cloth. And when you touch the cloth, how it feels is called the hand. And a cloth basically kind of indicates that it's a shortcut of fabric. And when you would go into the shop, it would be like on rolls, and it would be a short fabric would mean that it was more like a longer length of fabric. But anyway, they say cloth in the men's tailoring world. So I thought you might appreciate this, but in 1860, Henry Poole made a short evening jacket or smoking jacket for the Prince of Wales to wear at informal dinner parties at his estate at Sandringham. In 1886, a Mr. James Potter of Tuxedo Park, New York, visited London and subsequently was invited by the prince to spend, I think I got that date wrong, I think it's 1868, sorry, was invited by the prince to spend a weekend at Sandringham House. He was advised that he could also have a smoking jacket made by the prince's tailors, Henry Poole and Company. Then when the Potters returned to New York, Mr. Potter proudly wore his new smoking jacket at the Tuxedo Club. I'm from New Jersey, and Tuxedo, New York is a little bit above New Jersey. It's on the west side of the Hudson River. And fellow members soon started having copies made for themselves, which they adopted as their informal uniform for club or stag dinners. So as a result, the dinner jacket became known as a tuxedo, or a tux in America. So here's just a version in the later 1800s of a dinner jacket, which was also dubbed the tuxedo. Here's just a little flashback to the 1840s. The frock coat became standard day wear. So this is just a beautiful example of a frock coat, which is, a frock is a dress. So clearly it's like a long coat, sort of like a dress. And I thought that you might appreciate, if you've ever heard of George Bryant or Beau Brummel, is thought of to be the first dandy in history. And fashion historian Alice Ciccolini wrote, at the height of his popularity from 1799 to 1810, Brummel, the son of a minor nobleman, held the entire British aristocracy in his sway. His influence helped solidify the new restraint in menswear and Britain's leading role in that shift. So here on the left is actually an image of Beau Brummel and his little code of fashion. And he was basically a fashion icon. He was someone who was not from royalty himself, but he was, I believe, friends with the prince, and he kind of went in those circles, and he just became known for his clothing, and people copied him, and he was a fashion influencer basically. And thought that was kind of interesting. So we did talk about this a little bit last time, but just for the sake of context, I just wanted to revisit how the Industrial Revolution starts to change everything. So in the late 1700s, we see the places like Slater Mill have opened. The founder was from England, and I did visit Slater Mill, and my understanding is that he kind of smuggled some of these machinery designs with him. And it was, these machinery designs were extremely well protected in terms of secrecy, because this was a boom and everyone understood that this was something that was just going to take off, and people were very protective of their inventions and their designs for these machines. But my understanding was that he did bring with him some of these plans. I got that from when we went on a tour there. And so he establishes himself, and this Slater Mill, so close by to where we are, is known. It's actually known as the birthplace of the American Industrial Revolution. They use water power, which I didn't understand until we went and they turned it on. It was very interesting to see how it worked. It's all connected. You're in there, and it's all just kind of based on the rotating of this one wheel. But it does change everything. And so in the 1800s, we start to see a new whole world of, as you'll see, just plenty, like there's just textiles are just being made on a new mass scale that they had not seen before. And other innovations that we will touch on. But it starts to become a larger scale industry, and it does, these new machines change the way we consume fashion. It changes, it actually affects fashion itself, in my opinion. So here's just some of these inventions. A spinning frame from the 1790s. This one here is his very design. A flying shuttle, which was a fast weaving machine, basically. I know I'm talking a lot about like European and American fashions, and to go around the world would be a whole other lecture, basically. But I did want to talk about what was happening in terms of sharing and cultural influences around the world. So Orientalism is a fabrication of the West. So basically it's a fascination with what was going on in the East. And it's probably due to the fact that voyages were pretty perilous. So for you to go to any of these places and come back pretty much in one piece was like already kind of a miracle. But once you got there and once you were able to see what was going on in that part of the world, it was just an absolute subject of fascination to people. And that went on for a very long time. And so once travel becomes obviously like safer and more frequently, people are more frequently traveling, it becomes fashionable to travel. We see just more assimilations of the East with fashion and art in the West. So the 19th century is a time of universal expositions and colonial exchange. We think about the English and how they colonized, India and, places like that, the islands, and brought object categories such as silks from China, shawls from India, or after 1854, kimonos from Japan into the West, and created businesses of copying and adaptation. In addition to the great textiles, ideas of Eastern dress have come to be a part of Western dress, including saris and dhotis, I'm not pronouncing that right, from India, kimonos from Japan, kaftans, and jalabas from North Africa, and these just different pieces from all over the world. So this reverence for Eastern decorative art was happening as well in the art world. And as someone who also loves art, it's fascinating to learn about how painters at that time were obsessed with Japanese prints, and their artwork is completely influenced by that. And so art and fashion, all kind of blend together in this interesting way. And I just wanted to talk about some of the influences that we see. This is an early painting, but I don't know if you've heard it. We know the poet Lord Byron, Lord George Gordon Byron. He went on a tour into the East where and this was the Ottoman Empire at the time. So Spain, Malta, Albania, Greece, and Asia Minor. So it made a lasting impression on him. And so he brought back this outfit that he was painted in multiple times. If you look up, there's one of him standing, but he just loved this outfit. And This was an Albanian costume that he purchased over there that he brought back with him. Here's a dressing gown from 1880. This is actually from Japan. So even in Japan, you see a Western look, it's starting to all kind of morph. Above, this is a Van Gogh painting. Van Gogh was just one of the many artists that was obsessed. Apparently he owned, and a lot of these painters would buy Japanese prints and were very influenced by them. These bold lines, the kind of decorative feel to it is different from painting before. Here's a kimono dressing gown from 1885, and I just wanted to show this just stunning like embroidery that they were copying. This is a dress made from Chinese silk, and in the 1860s there was a bell-shaped sleeve, and they called this the pagoda style. Here's just an example, and that was based on this Eastern architecture that they were seeing. So. Now, women's fashion, we saw that empire waistline. It starts to change in about the 1820s. And I just wanted to discuss some interesting aspects of that. So as the waistline dropped, the skirt and the sleeves widened. By 1825, this early romantic silhouette was established with a natural waistline, meaning just kind of like middle, large puffed sleeves, which became very exaggerated, and a wide skirt with an increasing number of gores. Gores are basically just kind of like things that are inserted that make them kind of, kick out like the way you want them to. Through the second half of the 1820s, this silhouette becomes more exaggerated. So the breadth of sleeves grow, and they call it Lego mutton styles by 1827. Now you'll see that the skirt becomes bell-shaped, the waistline becomes tightly cinched, and we also see, I wanted to show you, we see the feet for the first time as well in a while. We saw the feet when we were looking at the empire waistline, but they keep the feet exposed at this time. And when you see feet, you have beautiful shoes and the need for beautiful shoes. And so at this time, shoes often matched the dress or would match the hat. So here's just a beautiful example from the Victoria and Albert Museum, these shoes from the 1830s. These rosettes were also very popular at that time. And I didn't include it, but hats were just over the top beautiful, like amazing. And hairstyles were also extremely ornate at this time. And sometimes the silk shoes would match the sash or the ribbons worn with a hat. Here are, meanwhile, in England, the Bronte sisters are writing. This is a painting by their brother Branwell. And then I wanted to talk about a tradition that came to be. So Queen Victoria comes to the throne in 1837 when she's 18. This is her wedding dress in 1840. She marries her cousin Albert, who she was, by all accounts, really in love with. And she made the choice to wear a white dress. And it's not, basically a white dress was not unheard of to wear for your wedding day. It was just one of many choices that people would pick for wedding dresses. She made the choice not to wear her grand ermine robe because she wanted to be humble for that day and to be more of a wife than a queen on that day. And so people admired her for this white dress. It also kind of featured the lace on the top. This is the actual dress that she wore. It was featured in Godey's Ladies' Journal, which was, the magazine of the day. And people admired this color choice for its innocence and romance. But this is interesting too, because here's an American wedding dress from 1837 to 40. Wedding dresses were not always white at that time. But wearing white to your wedding it showed your wealth in a way. So here, I'll read this. So while wearing white to your wedding was not new, it was not the only acceptable color. Young Queen Victoria set a trend of this, especially among non-royals. So wearing a white dress to your wedding became a show of wealth because it meant you could afford a dress specifically for that day. Because I can't overstate the value of clothing at that time. Clothing was very important to people. In the 1800s, there are stories of people stealing clothing as if you're stealing a car. Like there was a huge market for, what do you call it? Like consignment, and the secondhand clothing trade was very big. There were huge secondhand markets, and people would steal clothing, and people would even buy fabric almost like a savings bank and store it in their house because it had such value. Be like, oh, I don't need this fabric now, but I might need it later. It had much more value than we realize at this. I mean, these people, if they came forward in time and saw how we treat clothing and how, fast fashion the way it is now, they would be in shock. But so because of that, if you were getting married, you would choose a wedding dress that you would need to wear again. So for that reason, you would choose a wedding dress that was usually in russet brown, was a very popular color because it was a practical color to be reworn. And here's an interesting thing. You could have a whole different section about this, but sometimes people would wear a wedding dress that was in lavender because lavender was one of the mourning colors. Mourning meaning when you're grieving. And mourning clothing had a whole fashion code to it. So if you were mourning someone, your immediate color, there's stages of mourning. So you would have to wear black for the first 6 months or so. There were rules to this in Victorian England. And then I think it became a little bit more relaxed. You would choose, you could add gray trimmings. And then they say the last phase of mourning was wearing lavender. So it's interesting that people would choose often a lavender wedding dress so that they could ever wear it again. They wouldn't. By wearing white and choosing a white dress, it was a show of wealth that you could, and it was also hard to keep it white and hard to keep it clean. So this is something that is very fascinating to me. So in the late 1700s, the Industrial Revolution begins in England and gives way to mass expanded production of textiles. 1846, Elias Howe patents his first sewing machine. In 1852, one of the world's first department stores, Le Bon Marché, opens in Paris. A similar one, it's called A.T. Stewart's. Here's an image of it to the right. Opens, located at 280 Broadway in downtown Manhattan, opens in 1846. So this was a new experience, this retail world for fashion consumption. And department stores evolved from then on to include lounges, restrooms, and restaurants. They would grant access without the obligation to buy, and they would create lavish displays. So now shopping becomes an experience. It becomes a leisure activity. And don't forget too that people are more increasingly living in cities. By this time, Chicago was just a booming city. And transportation was readily available to people. And so shopping becomes something for a person to get out of their house and go do. It's an activity. So in the late 1800s, the first ready-to-wear, or in French, it's called prêt-à-porter, ready-to-wear, come to stores, and now a customer can buy clothing off the rack. The fashion industry booms as now available to people from all walks of life. The popularity of mail order catalogs, coupled with a more robust postal service, increased the availability of this ready-to-wear clothing. So the first American mail order catalog was started in 1872 by Montgomery Ward. And also department stores would offer free delivery and mail order services themselves. I love this. The first ready-to-wear garments were underwear, outerwear, and accessories. Notice how they're like not too fit oriented, because that would be a little too risky. They're not sure how it's going to go. So they're starting with this kind of these choices that are, if it doesn't fit perfectly, it's not a big deal. Cloaks became available in the 1860s, wrappers, petticoats, and chemises in the 1870s, tailored suits in the 1880s and 1890s, shirtwaists in the 1890s and 1900s, and finally dresses by the 1910s and 1920s. So as someone who's worked in the production world, I can see that they're getting more confident in the universal fit of things. We know the size 8 is going to fit all different people of a certain, of certain measurements, and then you can grade it up and you can grade it down. So fashions becomes a major industry for other cities like London and New York. So advertising, along with fashion illustration, becomes extremely important as a means to sell clothing in shops, newspapers, and ladies' journals. And one of the most important journals was this one called Godey's Ladies' Book. And this was the universal ladies' magazine at that time. Fashion magazines go way back. And I love this picture of this family with the children all out ready to go to the stores. That looks like she's with her like mother-in-law or someone, and then they're making an outing out of it. It changes the way people consume completely. So the sewing machine. People had been tinkering with versions of the sewing machine since the 1700s. But here are the first patented sewing machines. So A.A.S. Howe's design was copied by Isaac Singer and others, leading to, there was a huge litigating fight over, there was a court battle that in the end gave conclusive rights to A.A.S. Howe, because it all came down to the eye-pointed needle design. So it was very territorial at that time, with these machines, because they would make a ton of money from this, and they had to protect the rights to these designs. I think patent lawyers did very well back then. So at first they were mostly used by clothing manufacturers, but because they were making the new ready-to-wear clothing and shoes. But by the 1860s, consumers began purchasing them, and the machines, ranging in price from £6 to £15 in Britain, depending on the features, became common in middle-class homes. Which leads to the next, well, actually, in a couple pages, but I wanted to talk about something that starts to become a known phrase. With ready-to-wear, you also had this need for certain dressmakers and designers to stand out and to basically kind of, what's the word, express themselves with what they were doing. And this was called Haute Couture. And in 1858, this English couturier named Charles Frederick Worth established the first Haute Couture house. Haute Couture means high fashion, basically. This was called the House of Worth. And the word fashion designer became known, instead of before that you were a dressmaker, and now a fashion designer is somebody who is making those decisions and catering to these patrons, but they are the artist, they're the author of what's being made. So France becomes the place for this. In 1868, Le Chambre Syndicale de la Haute Couture was first established as the safeguard of high fashion. Designers were required to earn the right to label themselves a couture house. Then you would become a house according to certain specifications. So the clothing must be custom designed with fittings, with this backing by the city of Paris and a high demand for exclusive fashions that would distinguish someone from the increasingly common ready-to-wear looks that were now available to everyone, a new age of fashion design began. So fashion designers were now considered artists, and he even had a level of stardom. So to be considered a haute couture house, you had to have an atelier, a workshop, 15 full-time employees, and present at least 35 looks in a show twice a year. So many successful haute couture designers would follow. And then each house would have a brand, which often included other products like perfume and accessories later. And illustration would now be used increasingly to promote design houses and their products. And you'll see later that often a designer would have a special relationship with a certain illustrator. So here is a Worth evening gown, but that's a later Worth evening gown. Harper's Bazaar, founded in 1867, was one of the first publications dedicated to looking at the lives of women through the lens of fashion. And because he is known as the father of haute couture, I wanted to just give you more about Charles Frederick Worth. He was actually English, and he worked as an apprentice and clerk for 2 London textile merchants. So he gained knowledge of fabrics and the business of supplying dressmakers. So he knew a lot about trimmings. He knew a lot about the business. And I didn't include this, but apparently Worth would often visit the National Gallery, and he would draw portraits. So he was a little bit obsessed with like drawing women in historical fashion. So he relocated to Paris in 1845. So despite early struggles, he found work with a firm that sold textile goods, shawls, some ready-made garments, and became their leading salesman. So we know he knows how to sell. He eventually opened a small dressmaking department for the company, his first position as a professional dressmaker. He opened his own firm in 1858. So his rise as a designer coincided with the establishment of the Second Empire in France. So Paris is now an imperial capital and the site of many state occasions and a revitalized economy. So there was a high demand for luxury goods at this time, fashionable dress, textiles, reaching levels that had not been seen before, since before the Revolution. So Napoleon III married Empress Eugenie, and her taste set the style at court. So her patronage ensured Worth's success as a popular dressmaker from the 1860s onward. So basically, Eugenie was his first, perfect, his really great client. And basically, once he was making gowns for her, the rest kind of followed. But this picture of his wife, Marie, I listened to this great podcast, but she was really influential, and she would go to these homes, and she would basically really procure very high level clients for them. And she was apparently quite a presence in the house, and she organized everything, and she was, basically his partner. And they had 2 children, by the way. They had 2 sons, and in the end, his sons inherited the business from him. His designs were known for their lavish trimmings, impeccable fit, nod to historical fashion. Yes, he was a fashion history enthusiast. And because of his talent and self-promotion, he was thought of as the father of haute couture. So for the first time, the designer was the decision maker and the creator of the design, and the client was the passive patron. So a client would come into him and they would say, "What have you got for me?" And he'd say, "I designed this for you." Instead of her saying, "Can you do this? Can you do this?" He was now in charge. So that's what a fashion designer really is. And that's why this was a first. So this is Empress Elizabeth of Austria in a Worth gown in 1865, just beautiful. And, he's there to stay. And his gowns, just, they're in all kinds of museums all over the world, and they're just stunning examples of couture technique, really beautiful. I also wanted to talk about someone important in our country. So while he's doing that and dressing the royal classes in Europe, in our country, there was a woman by the name of Elizabeth, she went by Lizzie Keckley, was dressing American royalty. She had been born into slavery. It's a long story. She has a memoir, and it's a pretty sad story, but she had a very difficult life in childhood. And after much hard work and negotiating, she was able to purchase her own freedom and her son's freedom, and move to Washington, D.C. And literally, she worked as a dressmaker to earn that money. And it took so much time and negotiating. And it was just an outlandish amount of money that she raised, but she did do it. She continued to utilize her talents and skills, and had a thriving dress business, dressing socialites and politicians' wives. This is so fascinating to me, but some of her most notable clients were Mary Anna Randolph Curtis Lee, the wife of Robert E. Lee, and Verena Davis, who was the wife of Jefferson Davis. He would become the president of the Confederacy. So, but at the time that she was dressing them, the outbreak of war had not happened yet. So, I think it was Colonel Lee at the time, and he was just sort of, living in DC. And Jefferson Davis was a senator at the time. So she would go for fittings with Mrs. Davis, with Verena Davis, and she would be hearing all this stuff about the potential outbreak of war. Because, as we know, the Confederacy, people were planning on separating, after the election. I'm reading a book about it now, but I can't even imagine what that was like for her, to be a freed slave, to be sitting in the living room hearing all of this and trying to just fit this lady and hearing all these things that were happening. She was actually asked by Mrs. Davis, because the South were like, we plan to leave this union, we plan to go south, invited her to go with them, and she politely declined. She was apparently just a very elegant woman, obviously, just really hardworking. So after the war, she became the personal seamstress and best friend to the First Lady of the United States, Mary Todd Lincoln. She had a really booming business. She was selling her own designs. She was a philanthropist, and she helped people who were trying to rebuild their lives, people who were newly free. And so she really helped, a lot of these like refugees, basically, that were coming to the area. So her friendship with the First Lady later hurt her reputation, because Mary Lincoln, it's a long story, but she was publicly criticized for overspending, and she tried to sell off a lot of her clothing, and she was very unpopular at that time. And Elizabeth Keckley was kind of dragged down with her, and she was trying to defend Mary Todd Lincoln, and published a memoir about her own life that included some passages about her life with the Lincolns. But Mary Lincoln took it as a betrayal, and their friendship ended. So, she just had a really difficult life, and she ended up becoming a teacher at a college, but died with really not a lot. She just never was able to recover from that. But her work is gorgeous. Here's some of her examples. And she should be as well known as Worth. And I hope that people appreciate her beautiful work. Here are just some of her gowns. Here's her with her own design. And all right. I wanted to talk about the crinoline. So one way, I say, here's one way to protect your personal space. The word crinoline originally referred to a stiff fabric with a weft of horsehair and a warp of cotton or linen thread. So the weft would be going across, so it'd be stiff, and then the other way would be linen. So people would often wear these starched petticoats at that time. This is like in the 1840s and 50s to achieve that big skirt effect, but it was very hot and uncomfortable. So during the 1850s, the extension skirt was developed with rigidity added to the skirt in the form of cane and whalebone hoops and eventually flattened steel called the cage crinoline. This way, a woman could achieve that full skirt effect with less fabric. So it was actually thought of as liberating because it's freeing up your legs. At its height of production, 4.8 million crinolines were being produced a year. These were pretty cheap and everybody was wearing them. It was kind of an equalizer. They were an inexpensive fashion staple, and they were worn by wealthy and working classes alike. They were cumbersome and even a fire hazard. And if anyone has been to the Longfellow House in Cambridge, they may learn that Longfellow's wife actually died this way, and two of Oscar Wilde's half-sisters where their dresses caught on fire. But this is just such a subject of speculation. These voluminous skirt widths were due to increased accessibility. Why did people wear these? Why would you do this? And it was because of probably all the affordable textiles, because people had sewing machines, but also there's something about them that is like a personal boundary. I think about this with the pandemic going on. You couldn't get close to someone who had this on. And there are people that believe that this was sort of like a precursor to women's lib, that they chose this because they were basically protecting their space. Like they made it awkward for men to come near them. And it was a very male dominated society. So I think that had something to do with their popularity. But they got very, very wide, as you can see here. And even Worth was known to say, this is getting ridiculous. So here's a guy is trying to take her down to dinner and he has to go outside the banister. And here's a woman, everybody wore these. They were very, very popular, very cheap to make, and they were very popular. Other dangerous fashion. I just heard a pretty cool podcast about this, but with the rise of all of this industry, there was some dangers. So there was a particular dye called Scheele's green, and it was used for paper, wallpaper, paper hangings, paints, wax candles, children's toys. And it was also used to dye cotton and linen. It was more brilliant and durable than the usual copper carbonate. I'm not a scientist, but it was really bright and really popular. People wanted this like really zingy green. However, it contained copper arsenite or arsenic, whose the dangers were not yet commonly known. So on Muslim dresses, the dust would rub off, cause lesions and illness. And this on November 20th, 1861, a 19-year-old flower worker died of severe arsenic poisoning. And many other people, there were many deaths at this time from this particular, things were completely unregulated. It was used as a food dye and was linked to some deaths after a particular dinner party. People would die in rooms containing this wallpaper. And some even speculate that Napoleon may have died because of being in a room containing this pigment. But it's interesting that it just continued. So by the early 1830s, the danger of arsenical green had been recognized all over Europe, and by 1845, it had been banned in several countries, but not all. So William Morris was still using it for his wallpapers as late as the 1880s, but people knew about it and they were writing about it. So here was a satirical, from a magazine, The Arsenic Waltz. So be careful if you dance with the woman in green. So And here was the Philip Morris, the green wallpaper that contained this pigment as well. This is a fun fact, but we've all heard the word bloomers, you know, for they were the kind of pants that you would wear under, especially those cage crinolines. Those are due to Amelia Jenks Bloomer, who was an American women rights and temperance advocate. She was an editor of the first newspaper by and for women called The Lily. And it had a broad mix of contents, ranging from recipes to moralist tracts. And she introduced the two suffragists, Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony, to each other in 1851. In her publication, she promoted a change in dress standards for women that would be less restrictive in regular activities. So in 1851, the temperance activist Elizabeth Smith Miller, who was her cousin, I believe, adopted what she considered to a more rational costume: loose trousers gathered at the ankles, like women's trousers worn in the Middle East and Central Asia, topped by a short dress or skirt and vest. Miller displayed her new clothing to Stanton, her cousin, who found it sensible and becoming and adopted it immediately. So in this garb, Stanton visited Bloomer, who began to wear the costume and promote it enthusiastically in her magazine. So I swept this from Wikipedia, but she continued wearing the outfit for several more years as she moved from upstate New York to Ohio in 1853 and then on to Iowa. But eventually she started wearing the cage crinoline, the cage crinoline skirts, because she later wrote that she thought it was getting in the way. Her outfit was overshadowing what their true mission was. We all felt that the dress was drawing attention from what we thought of far greater importance: the question of women's rights to better education, to a wider field of employment, to better remuneration for their labor, and to the ballot for the protection of her rights. In the minds of some people, the short dress and women's rights were inseparably connected. With us, the dress was but an incident, and we were not willing to sacrifice greater questions to it. To the left is Amelia Jenks Bloomer in her outfit. And to the right is a statue that can be seen, that it depicts Bloomer is introducing Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton. I think I'm saying it right, Cady Stanton. But basically, this is apparently the spot where they met in Seneca Falls, New York, when they were attending an anti-slavery lecture. So that's where the bloomer comes from. Oh, we're out of time.
We are. I'm sorry to interrupt. This has been fabulous. So I will send out an email about part 3, because there has to be, just for me at least, there has to be a part 3. But Catherine, I want to thank you so much for, continuing to come back and to share this presentation with us. It's fabulous every time. And I want to thank everyone who has joined us. I put the program evaluation form in the chat if you don't mind filling that out for me. And we will send out an email about, I don't know if it'll make it to January. It might have to be pushed till February, but you will hear about a part 3. And yeah, thanks everybody so much.
Thank you guys so much. I hope it was interesting.